Good morning, everyone. Come in, come in. We're glad that you are here. Welcome. My name is Evan Garner. I have the privilege of serving as the rector of St. Paul's Church. There are lots of ways that is a charmed life, but one of them is that I get to spend time with some really faithful, fabulous people like Bishop Budde as they come and visit us. But I'm glad that you are here. I'm really grateful that those who are watching online are able to join us. If you were not here last night, watch the online video. It was a great evening, and I'm grateful to those who were able to be with us. There's a little less falderall on Sunday morning because we don't have as long, and we want to hear from our guests. So I'll say just a few words of introduction first. We're grateful to Tippy McMichael, Clifton Reed McMichael, in whose name and memory this lecture series is offered. She was a contributor, the largest contributor to our permanent endowment, and her generosity allows us to do things like this. If you want to know more about ways that you can leave an estate gift to St. Paul's for your own lecture series, I hope you will let me know. But we're glad that you are here. Bishop Budde, Mariann Edgar Budde, Bishop Budde, serves as the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington. Our own Bishop, John Harmon, was a priest in that diocese until we elected him to be our bishop, and one of our priest associates is still canonically resident in the Diocese of Washington, so we've got a lot of connections with that diocese. Most of us know Bishop Budde from a distance, which is to say we've seen her on TV, we've read about her in the news, we might have even heard some of our friends or our neighbors or our coworkers talk about her. Aren't you one of those Episcopalians? Tell me about this Bishop Budde figure. But what I think very few of us know are all the ways that Bishop Budde carries out the same work, the work of justice, the work of love, the work of compassion. Behind the scenes, when the cameras are off, we have heard stories about the way that she is present pastorally and supportive of those who are in need. Before she was elected the Bishop of Washington, Mariann served as the rector of St. John's in Minneapolis for 18 years. And you can't serve in a parish like that for 18 years and not have a pastor's heart. And that comes through not only in personal interactions, but even in a setting like this. I'm glad that you're here. Join me in welcoming our guest, Bishop Mariann Edgar Budde.
Test the microphone. Can you hear me well? Yes. Greetings. Wonderful to see you all. Hello to those of you joining us via live stream. Very happy to be back this morning. Just a second here. I'd like to begin with a prayer that is in our Book of Common Prayer, and it's a prayer for young persons. God, our Father, you see your children growing up in an unsteady and confusing world. Show them that your ways give more life than the ways of the world, and that following you is better than chasing after selfish goals. Help them to take failure not as a measure of their worth, but a chance for a new start. Give them strength to hold their faith in you and to keep alive their joy in your creation through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. I think that's a prayer for the young of heart as well as the young, especially that part about not taking failure as a measure of our worth, but a chance for a new start. So, I'm really happy to be back, and we continue our exploration this morning of moral courage, which I'd like to come by through a brief excursion, walking the terrain of another virtue, and that is the virtue of hope. It's actually one of the questions I'm most often asked in public settings. Bishop, what gives you hope? Which is an important question, given all that we're facing And our understanding of hope, like our understanding of courage, is critically important for the times that we're in. Oh, thank you. So at its most basic level, hope is our desire for certain outcomes or possibilities to be realized in the future, and we're understandably disappointed when those outcomes don't come to pass. Now, if what we hoped for wasn't that big of a deal, our disappointment will be short-lived, like tomorrow morning if you don't have a stake in the game, right? But when what we long for really matters to us, the disappointment can be devastating. And we speak of losing hope, of having our hopes dashed. And there's actually no way around the pain of that. And so that is precisely when we need to tap into deeper wells in search of a more resilient hope that enables us to persevere in the face of adversity and disappointment. And this hope, this is quoting now the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, this hope gives us eyes to see glimpses of light amid darkness. And when we see no light at all, to trust that light still exists. It doesn't deny difficulty or danger, and it does not minimize disappointment or loss, but it is not stopped by any of those things. The political dissident, poet, president of the Czech Republic, Václav Havel, he described this deeper hope as an orientation of the spirit, an orientation of the heart. It transcends the world that is immediately experienced and is anchored in somewhere beyond its horizons. And the great naturalist and environmental advocate Jane Goodall, if you haven't immersed yourself in her writings since her passing, I encourage you to do that. She would describe hope as humanity's survival trait. Without it, she said, we will perish. Because those who lose hope grow apathetic and do nothing. And those who live and act from hope in the hardest times are the ones who actually help create the conditions in which the things we long for can indeed come to pass. So there's a dimension to hope that's akin to spiritual practice, an intentional commitment to be a bearer of hope through thick or thin. And this practice has become increasingly important for me as I get older. Because the last thing the generations coming up behind me need, or any of us who are in our elder years, the last thing they need is our cynicism. The last thing they need is our despair. They don't need our sarcasm. They don't need our witty observations about how bad things are. We need to be wind in their sails, holding fast to all that is good, providing places of respite and encouragement for them, giving sacrificially of our time and our resources, and to keep the light of faith burning, just as our forebears did for us. And so there is also a dimension of resistance to the practice of hope, a choice to make every day to live in hope no matter what, and to stand firm to the best of our ability when the dominoes around us begin to fall. Or the theme from our time this weekend, when the turbulent winds begin to blow. And we can't keep this alive on our own, this hope alive. I know that I can't. And thankfully, we don't have to. For the question, what gives you hope suggests, this deeper hope I'm describing, it comes to us as a gift. Now, my interpretive lens is theological, that the giver of this deeper hope is God. But you don't need to be a person of faith to experience it, which is, in my mind, an expression of the giver's generosity. The gift can rise inexplicably from within, comes to us through the daily blessings of life that we can all too easily overlook, and most consistently and powerfully through the example of other people who refuse to succumb to cynicism and despair. Which brings me back now to the topic of courage. and the simple observation that courage is contagious. Courage is contagious. That is to say, like hope, courage is mysterious, it's communal, it passes through and among us like electricity, helping us to accomplish, as the Apostle Paul famously wrote, far more than we could ever ask for or imagine. Now, like hope, courage is innate. It's a God-given attribute to our species, enabling us to take all manner of small steps throughout life and sometimes even enormous leaps. It's a capacity we cultivate and strengthen through practice. And as with all attributes and strengths that grow stronger with practice, we draw strength and inspiration from one another. Right? So I once heard a radio interview with the novelist and essayist Marilynn Robinson. It's one of the great literary inspirations of my life. And the journalist asked her what gave her hope. And as she responded, first of all, it was immediately clear in her tone and her manner of speaking that this was not a woman who was easily shaken. And she said, I often remind people that we are a peculiar species with a long history of doing injury to ourselves and to one another. But just as there was no reason to throw up our hands during the 30 Years' War, I don't see any reason to do so now. Now, I confess to you that her reference to the 30 Years' War, which, remind you, was one of the most brutal conflicts in human history, devastating the European continent in the 17th century, it took me by surprise. Right? But her point was, if you're looking for reasons to give up on humankind, there was ample justification for doing so long before we arrived on the scene. And equally true and more important, if you are looking for something to give you hope, there is always reason for hope. And she said this, our hope lies, as it always has, in the example of other people throughout history and in our time who, inspired by God's grace, refuse to give up on what is best in us. And sometimes, to our amazement, we are the ones carrying hope for one another, for another, even when we don't feel hopeful ourselves. Just think about that, the responsibility of that. So what is it, do you suppose, about another person's hope, another person's courage that inspires us to be brave? I think it touches something deep within us because they're embodying in that moment either what we know to be true or what we hope for. And they show us by their example that it is actually possible to live according to that deeper truth. As I was preparing for the sermon for the inaugural prayer service last January, I read about a group of Roman Catholic bishops in California who had taken a strong stand in support of migrants in their communities. And their courage to say what we all knew to be true, that the vast majority of migrants and refugees are not dangerous criminals, but are active, contributing members of our society. They said that, and they inspired me. They gave me courage to do the same. And that, as I said last night, so basic a sermon that would not be unlike what you hear from the pulpit of St. Paul's, would be a source of hope for so many, says way more about where we are as a nation than anything I said. Now, I'm not minimizing it. I'm just saying that the ways courage is learned, practiced, and passed along isn't the stuff of headlines and news cycles. And nor is one sermon or speech consequential on its own. It is only decisive to the extent that it is linked to lives of integrity, faithfulness, and sacrificial love, and even more important, to communities and movements that are dedicated to a higher purpose. If it had just been me talking, it wouldn't have gone anywhere. We, a wider we, was talking. And that's the main reason I come to places like St. Paul's, to thank you for your courage, your witness, your refusal to give up hope. And even when you don't feel it, I have absolutely no doubt that you are all a source of courage and hope for other people. And I'd like to suggest to you that simply holding steady in a time of turbulence is an act of moral courage. Just holding steady. So I've been ordained for nearly 40 years. And the majority of my life as a parish priest, and during those years when I was a parish priest, one of the most divisive and defining issues of our church and the country at large was the full acceptance of LGBTQ persons, including their sacramental and civil right to marry. It was like, it's all we talked about. And for years, the most effective strategy for those who opposed same-gender marriage was to pass an amendment to state constitutions that specifically defined marriage as between a woman and a man. That was the most effective strategy to just halt the conversation in a given state. And in the years I lived and served in Minnesota, the prevailing wisdom was that if such an amendment were ever to come before the greater public in a public referendum, that it would pass, because the majority of voting Minnesotans opposed same-gender marriage in those years. This would have been in the 90s, early 2000s. And the only body that kept such a resolution off statewide ballots in those years was the Minnesota State Senate. And I don't recall the year, but I remember standing in the Capitol Rotunda in St. Paul with a gathering of people who were in favor of same-gender marriage, when the possibility of that becoming a reality felt like a far-off dream, and the fear of a constitutional amendment against it, the far more likely outcome. Pressure was building. And at that gathering, a state senator who's a good friend now, his name is Scott Dibble, he rose to speak. And he said something to the effect of, we just need to hold steady and keep this amendment off the ballot for another 5 years. Because by then, the tide is going to turn. I'm sure of it. And as he spoke, I knew, as a way, not like I agreed with him, but I just knew in my being that he was right. That we needed to, we didn't have to win arguments. We just had to hold steady. And I don't know if it was exactly 5 years later, but when the so-called marriage amendment was in fact on the ballot in 2012, and its goal was to enshrine marriage in Minnesota for heterosexual couples only, it failed. It was the first one in the country. And it failed because of a statewide campaign of people talking to their neighbors and making public service announcements and communicating a love and a celebration of their gay and lesbian friends rather than the fear of them. It was the first successful Vote No campaign in the country, and it was one of the many steps that paved for legislation and Supreme Court decisions to legalize same-gender marriage across the country. Courage is contagious. And I bring that story up because I think his words about the importance of holding steady they're really important to us now. Because it's devastating to read the news. Each day brings a fresh shock of something that for some of us would have been impossible to even imagine a few years ago. And retrenchment is real. And more I realize that resistance to this political and social tsunami requires all the courage and all the hope we can muster. We need each other. And we need countless quiet and heroic acts to protect as many people as possible and preserve as much as we can so that we can rebuild when the tide turns. And the tide will turn, not through wishful thinking, but because enough of us held steady and were ready to move into action when the time was right. Our hope lies, as it always has, in the dogged determination of people like you and me, who are inspired by God's grace enough that we refuse to give up on what is best in us. Okay? So I'm going to leave you with two thoughts. First, it really matters that we stand not only against something, but for something. Right? In other words, we have to have an alternative vision, alternative values that we choose to live by in a culture that is saturated with fear and contempt. And I mentioned last night, I've been deeply influenced by the work of Tim Shriver and Arthur Brooks and others who believe that the only viable alternative to this culture of contempt that conspires actually every day to keep us all outraged about something and at each other's throats. The antidote to that is a firm, unwavering commitment to treat every person, no matter who they are or what they stand for, with dignity. And I really encourage you to look this up. A group have come together to be part of an organization called Unite, and they formulated a dignity index. If you just type in dignity index in a search engine, you'll find it. And it's what it is. It's an 8-point scale that measures speech from the most contemptuous, which is a 1 on the scale, to the speech with greatest dignity, which is an 8. And you can look at it and you can say, well, that's really extreme and that sounds like Jesus, right? So that's like, there's a pretty wide range, right? The inflection point for the rest of us is between numbers 4 and 5. Because statements 4 and below move us down the scale of contempt. Statements 5 and above move us up the scale in dignity. And the transition points are more subtle than we realize. A level 4 statement, for example, mocks and attacks the other person's backgrounds, beliefs, commitments, competence, or performance. Something like, I just don't understand those people. Have you said that? We're better than them. They're not one of us. Whereas a level 5 statement it's not that much different, but it's open to the other side's point of view as it respectfully explains its own points of view. And the subtext is, the other side, I don't agree, but the other people on the other side have a right to be here and a right to be heard, and they belong too. And one of the great learnings about spending time with this index is what's known as the mirror effect. Because at first, this sounds like a really great tool to evaluate other people's speech. Right? It's great. Oh, yes. But over time, what happens is we begin to hear and evaluate our own speech and recognize how much we have internalized contempt without even realizing it. Right? And I can assure you, once you begin to hear the difference between contempt and dignity as it comes out of your own mouth, you cannot unhear it. If you don't hear it, you don't recognize it. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it. And it changes you. It changes the way you want to speak to others, no matter what they're saying. And the premise of the index is what we know, that the antidote to dignity, the antidote to contempt is dignity, just as the only antidote to hatred is love. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Hatred cannot drive out hatred. Contempt cannot drive out contempt. And so one final word, and then we'll open it up for questions, I hope, or conversation. And this is from the It's a piece of wisdom from the Quaker author and educator Parker Palmer. And he once said this: "You can learn a lot about people by figuring out who they mean when they say the word we." Who is included in our we? Now, this was back in 2002 when he said this, when we were dealing with the rise of anti-Muslim sentiment in the wake of 9/11. And he was encouraging us in a talk he gave to keep company with strangers, to welcome strangers, and to celebrate their presence in our lives and in our community. So let me just close by reminding you of what we all know, and that as a nation, we are capable of being one of the most welcoming and expansive and generous peoples on the planet. And we are capable of being among the most hostile and closed in. And we have both of those tendencies in our history and in our culture. And looking back on our history, we are never proud of the moments when we drew the circle tight. We're never proud of the people we became, the behaviors we justified, and the things we said when our we became small and self-protected. And we are always better as a people when we have an expansive we that embraces the beauty of all humankind. So, before I stop, I just want to thank you again for who you are, and to encourage you to hold steady with what you know to be true. Keep being people who refuse to give up on the best of us, who refuse to meet contempt with contempt, who honor every person's God-given dignity. And when you lose hope, as we all do, remember that's precisely when we have to go deep and look around and remember that courage and hope, the very courage and hope we need, flows through and among us. It is mysterious, it is communal, it is contagious, and there's always someone who's still standing. Look for them. Look for your beacons of hope and courage, and then pray for the grace to be among them. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop Budde. We have time for questions. Let me offer the same invitation that I offered last night. Instead of giving a speech, think about focusing on a question. We will save opportunities for speeches. This is an important time for speeches in our world, and we will look for more opportunities to make those speeches and to proclaim the hope that we hold in this world that needs that hope. Today, though, let's focus on questions. Who has a question for Bishop Budde?
Hi, Bishop Budde Lowell. If I may, I'll ask the same question today that I asked yesterday, and you can answer it the same or differently. But the question is, in your book, you write about how folks in Washington are practicing reparations. We're doing that here, too. So my question is, what could we learn from you? What would you say to us relative to reparations and y'all's efforts, as I understand it, to move $5 million from the Episcopal Diocese of Washington to African American initiatives?
Yeah, thank you, Lowell. Well, going back to the image of the things that we're not proud of in our history, and particularly now when there is such a concerted effort to erase all the things that might be painful for white people, frankly. I think it's an act of tremendous courage to continue to engage in a very particular institutional way the history of not only enslavement, which In the Diocese of Washington, we have churches that go back to the colonial era, go back to the land trusts. We have a goodly number of our churches that were built by enslaved labor. There's no doubt that some of the wealth of those churches, and by extension the diocese, comes from the slave economy. And not just the slave economy, but every other expression of racism and discrimination that followed from it. And we can trace our city's development, we can trace the placing of our congregations, we can place all of the history from Civil War, Jim Crow, to redlining. It's all imprinted in our architecture, in our communities and our histories. So first, just being willing to talk about that. And that was an act of courage and painful. And then we began to discover that, when you open up that seeming Pandora's box, there are actually other stories that surface that are of tremendous courage, right? That we actually learned other stories about our forebears that were inspiring to us because of the way they responded in their time. So it wasn't just all bad. It was also, oh my gosh, we aren't the first ones who thought that we needed to make repair and to strive for a better society, right? So there's that, like learning the whole story. And then setting aside, it's a very modest amount relative to the harms done, but we did want to put, we asked the diocese to set aside $5 million, which is a minimal amount, but it's a start. And we're looking at ways now to engage with specific communities on the harms that they experienced and look for ways, and it's led by our Black leaders, look for ways for us to begin to make significant investments in our communities. So that's what we're doing. It's slow, it's not going to end, it's going to continue, I pray. I had a friend once say to me, what would it look like to have an equitable diocese? And I had no idea what he meant or what that would look like. But as soon as he said it, I thought, I would love to be a part of an equitable diocese. And I wonder what that means. And what that means for me as a bishop, and I'll stop here, is that every congregation wants to thrive and grow and be a beacon of Christ's love in the world. There's not a congregation in my diocese that doesn't want to do that. And there are obstacles to that, right? Some of those obstacles are internal. Some of them are external. Usually it's a combination of both. But one of the things I spend time thinking about is, where are the places that as a diocese we can help remove some of the obstacles that are getting in the way, right? And I would suggest to you that our congregations in neighborhoods, predominantly in under-resourced concentrations of race and poverty, that they had a lot of obstacles. And wouldn't it be great if we didn't fix things for them, but we helped remove some of the obstacles that we helped create? So thanks for the question.
Other questions? I see one in the back. Yep.
Way in the back. Hi. Give our clergy some
Yes, good
steps.
morning,
Good morning.
Bishop Budde. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Claudia. I work in Springdale. As a teacher, I serve the most vulnerable kids in our community, immigrants. Do you have a message for the immigrant community in this area?
Well, thank you for your teaching. I would love to undergird and support your message to the children you serve, that they are beloved children of God, and that we are honored and to be entrusted with the responsibility of their education and their future. We cannot spare those who are in harm's way, the harm that they face. From a distance, we need to get close. And even then, we may not be able to. And so I think it's particularly important to be in relationship with their parents, to do whatever we can to offer as much support and protection as possible. We've had the sad situation in our diocese, perhaps you've had it here, where parents have actually been detained and deported while the children are still here. And so we're talking a lot about legal guardianship and how to navigate the terrain in those excruciating moments when a family has to decide, will they leave their children here or bring them with them when they go back, if they're given the opportunity to self-deport, right? As opposed to those who are in pretty horrific detention centers now. So I just want to thank you for your willingness to be among them and encourage us all to find our own ways to offer kindness and support. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Yep.
Two, one in the front, one in the back.
Yep. Vicki?
Hi, thank you for being here. My name is Vicki. I was watching on the news that in Minneapolis, there are a lot of people that aren't going to doctor's appointments because of fear of being departed. They're not getting their children's care taken care of. What can we do here for our immigrant neighbors to avoid this happening, to make them feel a little bit safer or to participate
Right.
however we can?
Yeah, boy. Well, one of the things that's been true about Minnesota is that, a lot of, as my son says, why does everything happen in Minnesota? They've had a hard go of it for a number of years, right? Starting with, anyway, so one of the things as the outcome of that is that there have been a lot of mutual aid societies that have been strengthened. There are a lot of ways that people who didn't know how to talk to each other before were actually in relationship with each other. There were a lot of neighbors who were reaching out to their neighbors before all of this happened. So there was some networks of engagement already that were in place. Now they're being expanded and tested by the day. But I think one of the striking things about it, and churches play a huge part in it, churches, mosques, synagogues, incredible networks of faith communities that are doing everything they can think of to not only help keep their neighbors safe, but I've heard of doctors making house calls. I've heard of, tons of people who are delivering groceries, who are tutoring children because their schools aren't safe. I know of one parent who is taking shifts with other parents to monitor the doors of their children's daycare so that there aren't any ICE officials going inside. Not necessarily for the kids, but for the teachers, right? Or in that horrible situation that we've all read about with the little boy who was kind of used as a tool to get his parents out, to get his father out. So I would just say pay attention now to the networks of community that you have, and get ready. If you think, I think it's probably happening already. It's happening all over the country, but as you can tell, the strategy is these sort of huge raids. I don't know if Arkansas is a target for that or not. But certainly the meatpacking plants and all of that are. The goal is to remove 3,000 people a day from our country. That is the stated goal. And that is putting enormous pressure on agents to detain as many people as possible, right? And so there aren't a lot of guardrails. And so all manner of people are being swept up in that, under that pressure. And the amount of money that has been dedicated to this effort is larger than almost any other budget of the defense, of the civil defense in our country and most militaries around the world. So it is staggering. So it's important to get close to the ground. Thank you for that question. And there's someone in the back. You had that, Charles, and then I see another in the middle.
Hi, my name's Jackson. Last night you spoke a little bit about sometimes people need love more than they need an invite to church.
Yeah.
Can you speak to how that is with holding steady and with being steadfast in turbulent times and showing that love? Can you speak to kind of how to show that to people?
And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying don't invite people to church. do that. But invite people to church if you are confident that what they will receive will be specifically helpful for them, right? So it's not like, come to my church because we're worried that we're losing young people, right? Not very compelling. But come, I'd love to have you join me for church, and then let's go out to brunch afterwards. Or there's a small group that's talking about X, Y, or Z, and given what you're going through right now, I think it might be helpful. Do you know what I'm saying? The point is, the focus is on the people, on the person. And for those of us who are elders, to think about the younger people in our lives, not in the abstract, but specific young people, and pour into them everything we've got. And if there aren't enough young people in our lives, go find some, because they're everywhere, right? And not succumb to this generational silo that we are so encouraged to live in, right? I'm not saying anything against, communities where people of a certain age, I mean, I get all that, but not to stay there, right? But to and that's what's great about churches and other communal things, so it's about love and about showing up. And then creating churches that would be actually helpful for the rising generations. Thanks.
Hello. Thank you so much for coming to speak to us today.
My pleasure.
And yesterday as well. I go to university in Kentucky.
Could you stand up so other people can see you?
I go to university in Kentucky, in Louisville.
Okay.
And we just got some confirmations from administrators that our campus is going to be raided by ICE officials in the coming months. And when I first heard this, my first reaction was a kind of hate I'm unfamiliar with. I wished violence and almost death on these people. Mm-hmm. I don't know how to protect my friends without hurting somebody in the process, and I'd love any guidance you have. Thank you.
Well, the anger is certainly an understandable response. We'd be made of stone if we didn't get angry. But this I know, that we need to find ways to channel that anger for love and not continue the cycle, right? The reality is that when your community is in the middle of an ICE raid, while things are happening, there's actually very little you can do without risking being arrested for a felony, right? And so the risks are high, as we've seen in Minnesota, for anyone who dares to interfere. So that's just a risk, it's a huge risk, and I don't recommend it, actually, for your own safety. What people are doing, which I think are, so it's, first of all, doing everything you can to surround your vulnerable friends and colleagues with concrete support. Make sure that they know their rights. Make sure that they're never alone. Make sure that they are never alone, especially in public, because that has a softening effect. And that, and it's unnerving, actually, to those who are doing the detaining. And I think we're seeing now that the administration has been persuaded that the aggressive tactics in Minnesota did not play well across the country. They've got far more subtle ones, by the way. We had a raid in Washington that was not nearly at the same level, and they can be very effective. So it really does require proximity, again, and care. But there's nothing to be gained from adding more violence or anger into the air. And that's where good self-regulation and, is so important. Thank you for the question.
We've got time for one more.
One more. An easy one.
Oh, no. I am so sorry then.
Who's going to win tonight, right?
So I grew up in both the Episcopal Church and in the Baha'i faith. My parents are married. practice different religions, but I was brought up in these traditions of you make a seat at the table for people.
Yeah.
You don't build barriers, you build more
Right.
table. And I've actually gotten involved in mutual aids up here because I feel so powerless with everything going on. So to the
Right.
point of like, hey, how do I get involved? Girl, I got you. But at the same time, I've also, living in this area, I have people in my family who are triple Trump voters, are okay with everything that has happened here. In making a place at the table for the people who need to be protected, for also the people who are going to have to live with each other after the tides turn.
Right.
How do I keep mental space and protected space in my life for these people, knowing that at their core, they are so opposed to the message of Christ, to the message of Baha'u'llah, to the message of like the universal message of every religion is love God, love your neighbor. How do I now have a seat at the table in my home for people whose neighbor is not my neighbor? Sorry for the very easy question.
A couple thoughts. Very carefully, right? Wisely. There's nothing to be gained by creating a situation that's going to just devolve into tension and conflict, right? And so it could be that those of us who are in that place that you described, and many of us are, is that we seek the best possible relationship with everyone, but we don't necessarily insist that they all sit at the same table at the same time. But that we are not opposed to creating tables where they are welcome, but we're not going to be stupid about it, right? We're going to be careful, particularly when people are vulnerable, or when we ourselves might be vulnerable. So just to keep our wits about us, right? And I also want to say, and I'll say this by way of conclusion, is that this is a very volatile, you don't need me to tell you this, but this is a very volatile moment in our country. And so we don't have a lot of control over some of the things that might happen. And so one of the things that I think people are trying to do, like you're trying to do so beautifully, is to think about where we do have some agency and choose agency where we have it, right? And to recognize that none of us would have chosen this moment to live in, right? None of us would have in this room would have chosen to be having this kind of conversation. Imagine the conversation we could have been having today if we didn't have to have this conversation, right? But we don't get to pick that. This is our time. And so one of the things we're saying to God and to ourselves and to our neighbors is that we're here. We're not going anywhere. And I think that may be the most powerful of all. There's that, and I'll just say this by way of conclusion, that there's this distinction between, there's a scene in the Synoptics Gospels where it's in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus says, when he asked basically for the cup to pass him by, but then says, not my will, yours be done, right? It's a really powerful moment where he doesn't want what's happening, but he succumbs to it, right? He surrenders to it. In the Gospel of John, the scene is different. It shows up earlier, first of all, not in the garden, but when he's in Bethany. And he has a similar moment where he's acknowledging that his heart is troubled. But the way what he says in John is, now my heart is troubled, and what should I say? Father, spare me from this hour? And then he answers his own question, no. It is for this reason that I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. And I feel like if we could make that our prayer, I'm not asking you to spare me from this hour. I'm asking you to help me to show up for it, because we are the ones who are here now. And that's the best we can do. And by the grace of God, we'll do our part. And in the end, as we believe, goodness and love and hope will prevail. And we're setting our sights on the long game. Thank you.
Let's say
And
thank you to Bishop Budde.
Thank you all. And to all of you. Thank you. Nice. So
As I mentioned last night, the next 3 Fridays at 6 p.m., people of faith are gathering for prayer for justice and peace, and prayer against state and community-sponsored violence. The next 3 Fridays at 6 p.m. This coming Friday will be at St. James Missionary Baptist Church, the week after that at Genesis Church, and the week after here at St. Paul's. And I hope you'll consider either showing up to pray or praying on your own Fridays at 6. Thank you for being here.